Welcome back to this series of lectures titled Our Living National Constitution, Its History and Evolving Interpretation. Again, I am Edward J. Dodson. This is the 8th lecture titled In the Long Run, We Are All Dead. On the 20th of February, 1946, Harry S. Truman signed the Employment Act of 1946. This legislation followed on the heels of the Keynesian revolution in macroeconomic theory and its policy implications. Economists sympathetic to the analysis provided by the British economist John Maynard Keynes now believe cycles of boom and bust could be avoided if government pursued a policy of compensatory finance. Keynes argued for higher taxes than needed for current spending during times of prosperity, so that a reserve fund would be available to spend during an economic contraction. However, the Employment Act of 1946 was watered-down legislation from what many progressives and liberals wanted, that is, a guarantee of employment for anyone willing and able to work. Instead, a Council of Economic Advisors was established in the Executive Office to oversee the direction of economic policy. The first three persons to serve on the council were Edwin Nourse, Leon Kesselring, and John D. Clark. This photograph includes other members of the administration. Edwin Nourse came from the Agricultural Division of the Institute of Economics at the Brookings Institution. Nourse served as chairman until 1949, when he resigned because his views in support of a balanced budget were not supported within the administration. Leon Kesselring was appointed vice chairman of the council and became acting chairman in 1949 after the departure of Nourse. Kesselring, an attorney, came from the U.S. Housing Authority, where he had been general counsel since 1937. John D. Clark was an antitrust lawyer who came to the council after serving in the Wyoming legislature. He also had a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University with an expertise in antitrust law. Here in this 1948 photograph is Clark with Nourse and Kesselring. The tenuous peace between workers and their corporate employers quickly dissolved with the end of the war. Anti-New Deal forces now began their determined effort to regain control over the nation's economy and social policies, as described by Professor Sitterman. After the war ended, General Motors workers, steel workers, electrical equipment workers, and meat packers went on strike for wage increases. It was the largest strike wave in American history, and stoppages that year contributed to a conservative political climate that brought forth Republican majorities in Congress in 1946 and the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. Taft-Hartley was the conservative countermeasure adopted to bring back the laissez-faire economic system of minimal government regulation and oversight. More from Professor Sitterman. Passed over President Truman's veto, Taft-Hartley stripped power from labor unions by allowing states to ban union shops, by prohibiting unions from engaging in secondary boycotts, and by preventing foremen and low-level supervisors from unionization. Responding on behalf of the liberal interpretation of the Constitution and what was now being referred to as the administrative state was Harvard University law professor James Landis. In the fall 1961 issue of Administrative Law Review, Landis provided his perspective on the court's authority in legislative matters. He wrote, "This movement of expanding the administrative process has continued and is likely to be a continuing method for keeping economic society in balance, whatever the alleged philosophies of our rival political parties may be." Professor Sitterman restates the case made by Landis and others who held the same perspectives. Landis argued that there were concentrations of power on a scale that beggars the ambitions of the Stuarts and that government action was necessary because certain enterprises possess such great public significance that their pursuit and control cannot be entrusted to private industry. In April 1994, an article by Gary Lawson, at the time associate professor at Northwestern University School of Law, appeared in the Harvard Law Review, in which he raised the issue of what had been sacrificed. The post-New Deal administrative state is unconstitutional, and its validation by the legal system amounts to nothing less than a bloodless constitutional revolution. Faced with a choice between administrative state and the Constitution, the architects of the modern government chose the administrative state, and their choice has stuck. Fast forward to 2025, and Professor Lawson applauded what he believes to be, quote, a sweeping and much needed firing spree in which President Trump went after the notorious independent agencies in the so-called headless fourth branch of the government. The threat of communist ideology creeping into the politics of Americans triggered a vigorous conservative response after the end of the war. In 1947, President Trump actually signed an executive order which mandated that all federal employees be investigated to determine whether they were sufficiently loyal to the American government. The House Un-American Activities Committee, established in 1938, now began efforts to expose anyone who was actively involved in the communist movement or even expressed sympathies to the communist ideology. In 1949, 12 prominent leaders of the American Communist Party were convicted on charges that they advocated the overthrow of the government. The person most closely associated with the hunt for communists during this period was Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. He gave a speech in February of 1950 in which he claimed to have a list of members of the Communist Party working in the State Department. He then initiated investigations into potential infiltration of the Central Intelligence Agency. Americans in 1952 were ready to celebrate the military accomplishments of Dwight Eisenhower by elevating him to the presidency. Although a Republican, Eisenhower's republicanism was more moderate than many others in the party, as explained in an article by Chester J. Pock, Jr. of the University of Virginia Miller Center. As president, Eisenhower thought the government should provide some additional benefits to the American people. He signed legislation that expanded Social Security, increased the minimum wage, and created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He also supported government construction of low-income housing, but favored more limited spending than had Truman. Eisenhower secured congressional approval of some important new programs that improved the nation's infrastructure. In partnership with Canada, the United States built the St. Lawrence Seaway. His most ambitious domestic project, the Interstate Highway Program, established in 1956, created a 41,000-mile road system. President Eisenhower, at the request of CIA Director Allen Dulles, demanded that McCarthy stop issuing subpoenas against the CIA. Documents made public in 2004 reveal that Dulles had McCarthy's office broken into and documents added to his files that contained disinformation so that McCarthy would be discredited. After this somewhat shaky start, the late 1940s was characterized by economic expansion and a significant sharing of the income and wealth generated. The economy grew by 37% during the decade of the 1950s, with gross domestic product rising from $200 billion in 1940 to over $500 billion by 1960. Of course, adjusted for inflation, the real increase was considerably less. Moreover, all that the GDP number tells us is how much money has been spent on anything and everything. There is no distinction between spending that improves life and spending that threatens life. Professor Satterman offers this. Shared growth and prosperity meant a stronger middle class on metrics other than wages. In 1940, 43.6% of Americans were homeowners. With the post-war boom, that number had hit 65.4% by 1980. What emerged beginning in the 1950s was a period of significant, if not absolute, harmony of interests between workers and corporate executives. Again, Professor Sitaraman. Negotiations established a social policy model by which private firms, rather than government, provided workers with the benefits of the welfare state. The agreement's provisions spread and eventually became standard throughout much of unionized industry. Non-unionized industry, employers hoped to avoid unionization, and even for manufacturers' white-collar workers. To be sure, a long struggle was ahead before women, persons of color, and other minorities would gain anything like equal opportunity within the American system. The effort to weed out anyone who challenged laissez-faire principles and the social status quo continued. 2 years after the founding of the John Birch Society in 1958, Fred Koch claimed that communists had infiltrated both major parties in the United States and essentially all mainstream organizations and institutions. The details of the decades-long effort to turn back social democracy, led by the Koch family and other members of the 0.1% in the United States, is examined by Jane Mayer in her 2016 book titled Dark Money: The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right. What Fred Koch provided at the early stage cannot be overstated, she argues. He provided substantial support for Barry Goldwater's right-wing bid for the Republican nomination in 1964. Goldwater, too, opposed the Civil Rights Act and the Supreme Court's landmark desegregation decision. Instead of winning, the far right helped ensure the Republican Party's humiliating defeat by Lyndon Johnson that year. She continues. In 1968, Fred Koch went further right still. Before the emergence of George Wallace, he called for the Birch Society member Ezra Taft Benson to run for the presidency with the South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond on a platform calling for racial segregation and the abolition of all income taxes. Then in 1960, American voters narrowly chose John F. Kennedy over the former Vice President Richard Nixon. Dwight Eisenhower was ineligible to run for a third term because of passage of the 22nd Amendment. The new president's inaugural address acknowledged just how interdependent the peoples of the world had become, and he called for a new level of understanding and cooperation. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it, and the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And we surely remember his ending line. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. During 1960, the United States had slipped into yet another recession. Business bankruptcies were at a level not experienced since the years of the Great Depression. Farm incomes had fallen by 25% since 1951, and 5.5 million people were out of work. Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors urged a reduction in marginal tax rates on income and the lowering of other taxes. However, the proposals were watered down by Congress, where Kennedy's support was razor thin. Across the nation, almost 70% of African Americans voted for Kennedy, and these votes provided the winning edge in several key states. When Kennedy took office in January 1961, African Americans had high expectations for the new administration. Unfortunately for blacks, Kennedy could not afford to lose Southern support for legislation on many fronts by pushing too hard on civil rights legislation. Instead, encouraged by staff, he appointed unprecedented numbers of African Americans to high-level positions in the administration and, as shown in this photograph, met with the Civil Rights Commission at the White House on the 21st of November, 1961. He spoke out in favor of school desegregation and put Vice President Lyndon Johnson in charge of the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. Attorney General Robert Kennedy turned his attention to voting rights, initiating 5 times the number of suits brought during the previous administration. The time had come for the federal government to do what was both morally and deemed by his administration to be constitutionally right. By executive order issued on the 1st of March 1961, Kennedy directed the establishment of the Peace Corps. During the campaign on the 14th of October at the University of Michigan, he asked the assembled students how many of them would be willing to serve their country and the cause of peace by living and working in newly independent countries in need of educators, doctors, engineers, or technicians. A month later, Kennedy ran head-on into a major crisis in the form of the CIA-orchestrated failed invasion of Cuba and Russia's reaction. Talks began in June with Nikita Khrushchev. In August, the East Germans began construction of the Berlin Wall in an effort to halt further defections. Domestically, the administration pushed for voluntary desegregation of public schools. In February of 1962, the United States placed an embargo on all trade with Cuba. In October, they announced that there was strong evidence of offensive missile sites in Cuba and that the United States was imposing a strict quarantine on the shipping offensive weapons to Cuba. After a tense few weeks, the Soviets agreed to remove all missiles. At American University on the 10th of June 1963, Kennedy spoke about negotiating a nuclear test ban treaty, announcing his sincere desire to make peace with the Soviet Union. He stated, "What kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time." The promise of John F. Kennedy as the nation's president was not to be fulfilled. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president on the 22nd of November 1963. Johnson was re-elected the following November in a landslide victory over his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater. Lyndon Johnson pushed for an expansion of government's role in determining social and economic outcomes. His first major accomplishment, writes Professor Sitterman, was passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The Civil Rights Revolution was therefore a great triumph, and not just for African Americans. Won after a 534-hour filibuster in the Senate, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 declared that discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin was an unlawful employment practice and banned discrimination in facilities that serve the general public. Next came amendments to the Social Security system, creating Medicare and Medicaid, the Higher Education Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act, and the Voting Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson looked to these and other measures as part of building the Great Society. At the same time, Lyndon Johnson continued the aggressive stance against the spread of communist-led governments beyond those already established. The Chinese had been stopped from taking all of the Korean peninsula. Johnson was now faced with a decision about another intervention, this time in Southeast Asia. The mechanism for such intervention in the Western Hemisphere was the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance signed in 1947, which led to the creation of the Organization of American States the next year. U.S. troops were sent into the Dominican Republic during that country's civil war. Rafael Trujillo, who had ruled since 1952 as an unelected strongman under figurehead presidents, was finally assassinated in 1961. Chaos followed until the remaining members of the Trujillo's family were exiled. A new election was finally held in 1966, and the U.S.-supported candidate Joaquin Balaguer became the new president. Balaguer was still president in 1992 when the annual conference organized by the Council of Georgist Organizations was held in Santo Domingo. In 1965, a Dominican national named Lucy da Silva, who had been living in the United States as an exile from the reign of Rafael Trujillo, returned to establish an extension of the Henry George School of Social Science. At the conference, she described the terrible poverty endured by roughly one-half of all Dominicans. Many books have been written analyzing the reasoning that turned the United States into an interventionist state on the global stage. Miscalculations by Joseph Stalin certainly played a major role. The details finally came out in the 1984 book Endless Enemies by Jonathan Whitney. He writes, "Since World War II, the Earth has staggered through a gauntlet of crises over countries far too weak in themselves to threaten either of the major military powers, the United States or the Soviet Union. These current and former crisis points scatter the globe. There is also a dangerous hypocrisy at work. Unlike the great imperial powers of the past, today's two great powers mostly shun nationalistic rhetoric. They baldly deny that they are building empire. Almost in unison, they proclaim an ideological motivation and justification for what they do. They argue that by enabling the rule abroad of those who proclaim an ideology similar to theirs, they are performing a selfless favor for other countries." At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, a decision had been made to divide Vietnam, which had been a French colony for over 100 years, into British and Chinese spheres of influence. Soon after the surrender of Japan in August, Charles de Gaulle sent the French Far East Expeditionary Corps to re-establish French sovereignty there. However, Ho Chi Minh, leader of the Viet Minh independence movement, declared Vietnam's independence in September, and the First Indochina War broke out. Eventually, Allied ships were provided to bring French troops from Europe to Indochina. Thousands more still remained as unarmed former prisoners of the Japanese. The situation was tense, but a full-scale war between the Vietnamese led by Ho Chi Minh and the French held off until December of 1946. A formal request to the United States for military assistance came from the French government early in 1950. President Truman approved aid to the French on the 24th of April. This was just a few months after the Chinese nationalists were driven from the mainland to the island of Taiwan. So, there was great concern among American leaders that communism would continue to spread. Later, in April of 1954, Eisenhower, as president, expressed the concern directly at a press conference. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is that it will go over very quickly. So you have a beginning of disintegration that would have the most profound influences. A rather remarkable document was issued in 2004 by the Office of Joint History in the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The title is The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the First Indochina War, 1947 to 1954. A few salient points are worth repeating. The report states, Over time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff learned of the complications that might arise over the French colonies. In January 1943, President Roosevelt told the chiefs that Ambassador Robert Murphy had exceeded his authority in conveying assurances to the French before the North Africa landings. For some time, Roosevelt's views on Indochina had been based on his hostility toward the European colonial empires, a view that was not unusual in America. The surrender of Japan did not bring immediate peace to Asia, but the U.S. government assumed that its goal now was to get out of the region. In Indochina, America recognized French sovereignty, but did not consider itself obliged to help them regain control and did not want to appear to be helping. By 1950, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded that concrete action was necessary in Indochina. President Truman concurred. Secretary of State Dean Acheson told Truman, "The choice confronting the United States is to support the French in Indochina or to face the extension of communism over the remainder of the continental area of Southeast Asia and possibly farther westward." After providing the details on the long list of interventions by the United States into the affairs of other countries over 30 years after the end of World War II, Jonathan Whitney stops to remind readers of just how much went terribly wrong. The history of meddling by one country in the affairs of others, no matter who does it or why, is littered with backfired actions. Governments often misjudge what their own people will do, so how can even the most learned and advanced of rulers safely make assumptions about other societies and other cultures? The manipulators never stop to consider what their dioxin might kill besides the weeds. And yet the United States, under the constant encouragement of the government foreign policy elite, has turned more and more of its economy toward that lethal business. We not only pass the poison chalice that will return, we make it one of our chief exports, all in the name of fighting communism and the next newest threat to the American system. This last bracketed comment is my addition to that of Whitney. It did not take very long after Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president before he set military victory in Vietnam as his top priority. Returned from a visit to South Vietnam, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara urged an increase in military support. Now, with every passing month, Johnson faced increasing opposition and protests against the war. An important constitutional question was finally resolved in 1967, specifying the rules of succession to the presidency. The debate over how to address the problem began in 1965 with joint resolutions introduced by Senator Birch Bayh and Representative Emanuel Keller. Congress approved the 25th Amendment on July 6, 1965. The states completed ratification by February 10, 1967, and President Lyndon Johnson certified the amendment on February 23, 1967. His popularity squandered in the jungles of South Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson stepped aside in 1968. Hubert Humphrey secured the Democratic Party nomination over Eugene McCarthy, the peace candidate. George Wallace entered the race as an independent. Richard Nixon bested Humphrey by 500,000 popular votes and over 100 votes in the Electoral College. And we have reached the end of Lecture 8.